Hey man, what's up?
Hey, I got the right Wish Klon Clone, and what am I missing? It's not that great.
Well, what are you playing on?
My guitar?
Yeah, no. What amplifier?
Oh, it's my, digital amp sim.
Oh man. You're listening to it on your headphones, aren't you?
Yeah, what's wrong with that?
I'll do a video.
Could you just tell me?
I'll do a video.
So before we do anything at all, let's do a quick hearing check. Can you tell the difference between a real analog tube amp versus a digital amp simulator? I have my $1,400 Supro 1685 RT, it's a real tube amp, versus a Native Instruments guitar rig that comes in about $300, versus a Positive Grid Spark 40 amp, which is about $300, also $250 maybe depending, versus the Behringer TM300, which is a $30 tube amp simulator. All four of them are getting identical sound from my Wish Klon Clone. Can you tell which is which? Which one's definitely the real tube amp, or which ones are definitely the digital amp sims? Maybe you should use headphones? Maybe not. Listen however you want, but let me know how you listen, I'm curious. After these play, I'm going to give you about 5 seconds so that you can go back and listen. You may want to re-listen a couple times. I really hope you write down, what you think is what and put it in the comments. See how close you are. We have to know for science, right? Alright, let's give these a listen. A. B. C. D. Okay, now, this is your little 5-second break. You can push the playback scrubber back to the beginning of the test if you want to give it another listen. Again, I hope you write down which one you think is what and put it in the comments. Don't lie, don't cheat. I want to see how many people actually get this right. It's for science. Alright, it's been about 5 seconds. So the answers are A, the guitar rig from Native Instruments set to a Fender-style amp. B, the Positive Grid Spark 40 amp set again to a Fender-style amp. C, the real tube amp, my 1685 RT from Supro. And D, the TM300 set to Tweed, i.e. Fender. Obviously, the guitar rig plugin from Native Instruments is by far the closest to my Supro amp, but that's not all. It actually gets more interesting, and we're going to dive into this. First, we got to talk about 3 or 4 things. First, all the audio you hear in this video is available for download in a Dropbox link, which I have in the description. I hope you download it, and then you can listen to all the different clips and really compare them on your own time. Or maybe you'll find some interesting stuff I didn't pick up while I was doing all this comparison stuff. It has every iteration of the Klon Clone settings I had that I sent to all of the amps. 2. I have a disclaimer in the description as well that talks about how I handled the audio for this video, in terms of mixing and mastering and whatnot. I think it's important to be upfront about what I did, because I did make some changes. If you think I'm being esoteric or you don't understand what I'm worried about, then don't worry about it. 3. So in the previous video, Timbo name-dropped the Strymon Iridium amp sim, pretty deliberately I might add. I had thought I was going to be able to borrow one from a friend and use it as one of these comparisons, but I was wrong. Some stuff happened. It's part of why it took me a while to get around to this video, and now I'm not using it. I would just say I've never been able to use one, and since I didn't get to use it for this one, I have no opinions about one way or the other, just I thought I was going to be able to use it, and I kind of spoke too soon on that. So I am not saying anything good or bad about that. Please forget I ever said that. And 4, if I seem a little stiff, it's because I got my puppy with me. He's sitting in my lap. He does not want to leave me right now for some reason. He's such a good boy, right? Okay, we're going to compare the clean sound in all these amps, but before we do, I want to talk about how I recorded this. I recorded that riff into Pro Tools, which then I routed out using a reamp box into the Klon, which then went to a Morley tripler, as well as a splitter, enabling me to send the same signal to 4 different devices. That way, anytime you hear a particular Klon setting, rest assured that same setting is going to all of the devices. It's not like I redid it 4 times for each setting, it's exactly the same. I think it's pretty smart, honestly. Alright, let's hear the clean. Supro. Guitar rig. Spark 40 amp. TM300. Okay, so a couple things stick out to me. First is that I think it's interesting that the Supro amp, while at other settings definitely sounds more warm and has more low end than the rest of them, it actually has the least low end when they're all clean, which is weird. Also, the Supro sounds the most saturated of the 3. Like, you can tell it's already got like a tiny amount of breakup, which is weird because it wasn't being pressed that loud. That's just the nature of the sound, I guess. So it sounds somehow a little less clean than the rest of them, but you know, that's okay. Also, I noticed a bit more attack on the other 3, whereas it seems to get rounded out by the amp. So yeah, it sounds like the other 3, their idea clean is quite a bit cleaner than a real tube amp, but you know, some people might really like that. Alright, let's go back to the normal settings, and when I say normal, it's because I grabbed these settings off of a gear page in a forum, and they said that they were Bill Finnegan's preferred settings. I have no idea if that's true, but they are pretty good, like, you know, middle of the road settings, and pretty close to what even I use on them most of the time, except they probably have a bit more gain, which I think is how more people use it anyway. So let's go. Supro. Guitar rig. Spark 40 amp. TM300. Now, rehearing those same clips we listened to the first time, in this order I'm noticing, you know, things a bit differently. The Supro definitely has a bit more hair, a little bit more fuzz on it, as opposed to the guitar rig one. Whereas the guitar rig clip sounds like, you know, it's trying to be clean. You only really hear it break up on the attacks, which is kind of makes sense, I guess, if you think about how the audio is getting processed. Yeah, the Spark 40 amp, I don't know how to describe that sound, but when you listen back to them, it adds like this weird fizz flutter thing on top of the guitar sound, which I personally don't really like. I know I've heard it in some places, but I'm not really liking it here. TM300 is definitely the brightest of all, you know, 4 of them, and it's lost all of that low end. It's, again, not bad, but definitely more of like a lead sound despite getting the same settings from the Klon. Okay, from here on out, we're going to be using the normal settings as sort of a starting point. So everything we do is about taking those settings and then saying more output, or more gain, or more output and more gain, or more gain and more treble. The idea being that whatever settings we leave alone are the same as the normal settings we had started with. I did find something that I thought was pretty interesting, which we're going to kick off with. First, let's listen to it with just the treble maxed. Supro. Guitar rig. Spark 40 amp. TM300. So going from the Supro to the guitar rig, the same sort of change is noticeable. Like the Supro has a bit more hair on it, whereas the guitar rig has a bit less hair and you hear it more on the attacks. One thing I thought was interesting is that when you're listening though from the guitar rig to the Spark 40 amp, they're actually really close if you like mentally take out that flutter that the Spark 40 amp is adding for some reason. Meanwhile, the TM300 is still doing its own very, lead thing here. But the weird thing happens when we leave the treble maxed and now then add the output being maxed as well. So that means it's being as loud as it can and as much treble as it can while the dirt is still staying in a pretty, middle of the road position. Let's listen. Supro. Guitar rig. Spark 40 amp. TM300. So all of them except the guitar rig behaved the way you think it would. The way it sounded to me was like someone turned the treble knob back down. I actually went back into the file in Pro Tools and made sure it was being sent the right audio, and it was. Like, that's just how it sounds. For some reason, sending the maxed output to the guitar rig, I'm not even sure how to explain it. It almost deactivates the treble knob, the way that the plugin is interpreting the signal. I have some thoughts about this, but you'll notice, let's listen now to just output max, so it's all the normal knobs plus output to the max. You'll notice that compared to output and treble maxed on just the guitar rig is nearly identical. So we're going to listen to just the guitar rig with output and treble versus just output maxed.
Guitar rig with treble and output maxed. Guitar rig with output maxed.
So yeah, the difference on those two are incredibly subtle. It sounds like just output versus output and treble max has like a little bit more hair on it. Like adding that treble somehow makes it cleaner. So, I wish I had a good way of explaining this. However, while I think this is interesting, one thing I think is more incredible is that guitar rig still sounds like good. It sounds pretty dang good, right? And thing is that the way it gets recorded is that it has to go through the preamp on my interface, which then goes into, gets recorded into Pro Tools, which then goes into the guitar rig plugin. What's weird, and you'll know if you look at the waveform of just the DI signal, here's a picture of it, you'll notice that it's square waving out. Like it's blasting past my preamp and it's overloading and clipping. That shouldn't sound anywhere near as good as it did. And I honestly thought it was going to sound horrible. It was going to be an easy way for me to make my final point, which I'm going to make later, but I was wrong on this one. Even though I thought it would overload my system in a bad way, I'm actually really impressed that Guitar Rig knows how to handle that signal. It's weird, but cool. And yeah, the way it's reacting to this overblown signal as compared to my tube amp I think is also interesting. But that's the whole idea of this. Alright, let's backtrack a little. We're going back to the normal, but now this time with only the gain max. Supro. Guitar rig. Spark 40 amp. TM300. So obviously it sounds like the Spark 40 amp is just kind of losing its mind with all of this gain. I find it interesting how hard the guitar rig seems to be trying to preserve the low end and not let it, just drop out, as opposed to the Supro. And this is pretty normal with Klon clones. Also, it happens with tube screamers, obviously, where you bring in the gain, a bit of the low end seems to drop out, and that's not happening with the guitar rig. So, what does it mean? I don't know. I'd like to know what the processing was that does this on the internal side, but honestly, it's kind of beyond my comprehension. And again, the TM300. Boy, it does not want to work with this sort of sound. It's, at this point, just super nasally to me. Now we're going to leave the gain maxed and also max the output. Supro. Guitar rig. Spark 40 amp. TM300. Man, I still just love the way my Supro sounds here. Guitar rig seems to be doing a bit better about not adding in more low end, like having the extra signal seems to be finally making the low end pick up like it's supposed to. But it seems like it's still having a wee bit of trouble. It doesn't sound as clean as my Supro amp. Yeah, Spark 40 didn't sound great with the gain max. Now gain and output max, that's just a mess, isn't it? Same with that Behringer TM300. It sort of definitely left the territory of maybe being a more nasally slash high gain version of like a Fender amp, and just gone to almost like Line 6 territory. And we're going to listen to one last final set of them where all the knobs are maxed out. We have to do all the knobs maxed out, it's more is more better. Yeah? Supro. Wow, hang on a second. Is it just me or does all maxed on the Supro sound basically the same as gain and output maxed on the Supro? Let's listen to those two real quick. Supro gain and output maxed. Supro all maxed. Yeah, they're pretty close, but the all max is just like a hair brighter. But I guess since all the frequencies are already maxed out, just adding more treble, where it's already like as high as it can go is the most it can do. I guess it's like a law of diminishing returns, but with audio or something. I don't know. Anyway, here we go for the rest of all maxed. Supro. Guitar rig. Spark 40 amp. TM300. So yeah, actually, when you go back and listen to all max versus just gain and output max, there's actually only very little variation with each amp in itself, between the two settings choices, which I think is interesting. It makes me wonder about the efficacy of 5 clones into 1 amp. Like, how much of a difference could I really make? Maybe someone can tell me more about that in the comments. I'm pretty interested in understanding why it makes so little difference. So, before I share, my final thoughts and conclusions and the final point of all this, I do want to put out there that I am not like a tube amp purist by any stretch of the imagination. The reason I have guitar rig as well as say amplitude from IK Multimedia, which I also really dig, is because in a lot of studio situations it makes more sense to use those with different singer-songwriter or rapper clients I have, where sometimes you just need stuff to move a little faster, or sometimes the sound you need is just right there and maybe you want to change it a little bit later. I like a lot of of those plugins, and sometimes I'll use them instead of my pedal board and my real tube amp. That said, I'm obviously very partial to my tube amp. I think there's a place in the world for both of them, and I'm not really here to, trash talk anything. I think everything has its place in the music world, and I know some people who, like me, have a rock and tube amp, But then they also have like a Kempfer Axe, whatever that amp is called, or like a Line 6 Helix, which can sound really good, and God knows I've been tempted to get one of those. So this is by no means a, hey, see how much better my tube amp is than these other options out there. Instead, what I wanted to focus on was how these reacted to a Klon Clone. Because even though I'm comparing one real tube amp to 3 digital amp sims, I'm actually comparing 4 very different pieces of technology. Obviously, the real analog tube amp is a real analog tube amp. That amp gets loud and kind of painful sometimes, and I love it. Meanwhile, the guitar rig is a studio plugin. It's not meant for playing live, it's meant for playing in the studio and having something for just your recordings that you're going to put out on Spotify. It's not meant for live playing. The Postive Grid Spark 40 amp, on the other hand, is actually more of a practice amp that you're supposed to have your headphones plugged into, and you can practice in a low to no noise sort of situation. And it's supposed to have all that stuff in there so it's easy to use without having to bust out all the pedals. And the TM300 is more or less just a, let's say it's more of a distortion kind of thing that you put on a pedal board. It's not really meant to replace a whole tube amp, although it has some stuff that lets you do it. And as you can hear, some of it's certainly usable, probably more like a surf rock sort of setting. But even the TM300 doesn't have an amp, and it can't make that much noise on its own without having a speaker attached. The Spark 40 amp does have some speakers, but they're not going to last against, say, my tube amp. So ultimately, at the end of the day, we're not comparing apples and oranges, apples being the tube amp, oranges being the digital amp sims. We're comparing apples, oranges, bananas, and watermelons. Each one is fairly different. So then you might be asking, okay, Brian, was this all a waste of time? No. Sort of, but no. You see, the reason I really wanted to do this video is because I've seen a lot of people review Klon Klones, especially, this one, but sometimes these ones, and they'll plug them into these digital amp sims. Sometimes it's something nicer like a Strymon Iridium, which I've not tested, so I don't have an opinion about it, and sometimes it's less nice. And they'll walk away saying, man, I don't see what people like about this pedal. But as you can tell, what you plug it into can actually really matter. Something like the Spark 40 amp, in my opinion, I don't think it's really supposed to work with external pedals. The TM300 sounds like it's supposed to be the only distortion in there, maybe. Like, if I were to use the TM300 and the Klon on my board, I'd probably have the Klon after the TM300, honestly. With the guitar rig, while it kept up, like I said, with the real Supro amp pretty well, you can tell it wasn't really meant to work with it in this way, especially when we started using the more extreme settings. It did a pretty good job, but the Klon Clone, or rather the Klon, was designed to be used with a tube amp. And not just any tube amp at that, it was designed to be used with a Fender tube amp, which my Supro is pretty close in the topology to. And, you'll see some people plug a Klon Clone into other different amps, say like a Marshall, which has a totally different tonal footprint, or an Orange amp, or something else like that. And we're going to do another video about that another time. But right now, the main thing I'm tackling is when you plug something that's meant to interact with a tube amp in a particularly tube amp sort of way into something that's not a tube amp, it may not behave right. Again, not making any sort of value judgment on the other equipment, just it's meant to be used a particular way. Yeah. So I hope you found all that interesting. Again, hit that Dropbox link, download those files, do some other comparisons, find stuff that I didn't catch. A lot of this was fairly just me listening through and saying, yeah, this is different in this way. I found some things interesting, some things sounded better at some settings versus others. And of course, in the meantime, do all the YouTube stuff. Let's hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the comments up, and tell me what you thought. Share me with all your friends, share me with all your enemies, and above all, keep playing. Hold on. Not again.
Hey, okay. So if I don't want to spend any money on an amp, would a plugin work?
What?
Like, my friend's Spark amp has a Klon plugin in it, and Would that do the job since it's just software, interacting with software? There's also like a VST I can get from my DAW.
I want to say no, but honestly, I'm not sure. I think it'd do better than, say, a Klon Clone going into a cheap amp sim. But as good as a real pedal going to a real tube amp, I could be wrong, but I don't think so.
Scared it will sound better?
Guess I'm doing a video.
Oh man, I was just joking. You don't have to.
Now I'm doing a video.